Epilogue. 12 years before the events in Team Gold. Ashpenaz knelt before the young child as he distanced himself from the other two individuals in the room. "Look at me," he said in a calm but commanding tone, and the child obeyed. Nebo looked on with fascination as Daniel hid behind him. His eyes first revealed themselves to be pitch black and clouded, yet the longer he held his adopted son's gaze, the more they calmed and parted like a passing storm. Ashpenaz got to his feet and guided the boy, who had visibly calmed down. Daniel was still cautious of the familiarity he felt in the boy's presence, but they all knew that would pass in time.
"So you're willing to commit to this? The more he reflects your soul, the more you're going to have to hope the others he interacts with won't undo the imprint you're leaving on him."
Ashpenaz looked back at the child, who returned the gesture.
"He's not just his semblance. He will be able to make his own decisions."
Nebo frowned slightly.
"And what of those he cut down?"
Ashpenaz let out a small laugh.
"He'll remember. You didn't like being how we found you, did you?"
The boy shook his head.
"I don't want to hurt anyone."
It was then that Ashpenaz took his eyes off of him and met Nebo's gaze.
"That is what I'm willing to bet this on."
He took his hand off of the boy's shoulder and allowed him to look around the room. His eyes first went to Nebo and took on an inquisitive posture. He examined everything about him, down to the patterns stitched into his clothing. This made Nebo laugh.
"It's like looking in a mirror."
The boy smiled slightly in return, which drew Daniel out of hiding. Their eyes met, and they began to turn gray. He became quiet and slowly moved behind Ashpenaz, as if he felt in danger from a presence he couldn't quite identify. Daniel began to feel bad and moved to assure him not to be afraid. The boy's body language suggested he wasn't ready to trust him, but was still willing to accept the gesture. He took the boy in a hug, despite the hilarious size difference between the two of them, and the gesture was returned. Nebo continued to note the behavior pattern until one concern came to mind.
"What if he encounters someone different?" he said quietly. "We'll hope he has grown enough by then to control himself. He will have to consciously deny himself sleep, but I'm willing to trust him."
Both of their eyes went to the small sword in his right hand.
"And for those he cut down, he'll remember,"
Ashpenaz repeated as he made his way to the blank birth certificate on his desk.
"It is then that I trust he'll learn friend from foe."
With that said, he filled in the first name, Gideon. Nebo observed all of this taking place and smiled as his legacy was manifest before him. Current day.
"We can't keep doing this, instructor,"
the huntsman stationed at Shady Academy explained as they returned from yet another fruitless search attempt. Nebo looked at them in kind, heartbroken as the instructor remained stoic.
"I taught you all better than to give up."
The huntsman shook his head.
"I'm not talking about those we've lost. I'm talking about those we still have."
He gestured back to the transport to show that several more of them had been wounded. Nebo gestured for the medical teams to begin doing their jobs and moved to rest his arm on the instructor's shoulder.
"But you did find something,"
Nebo stated matter-of-factly. The huntsman nodded, and another of their number produced a dark blue cloth containing a knife and pieces of a light blue rifle. Nebo's heart sank as he recognized his old weapon. The instructor's further when he saw Leia's blade. Another of their number struggled to move the hammer from the ship onto the hangar floor. Both of their eyes went back to the huntsman, each polarizing one another with the hope found in each.
"But you didn't find any bodies?"
The huntsman shook his head.
"And no readings on thermals?"
Ashpenaz pressed further as the huntsman prepared himself for yet another recovery mission.
"You've done all you can,"
Nebo interrupted, drawing both of their attention.
"Treat your wounds and get some rest. And thank you for finding what you've brought us."
The instructor moved to interrupt, but the frail grip tightened on his shoulder, reminding him that his father knew what he was refusing to acknowledge. With the instructor remaining silent, the huntsman cautiously saluted and moved to return his arm to its sling. Leaving them both alone, Dr. Nebo and the instructor both processed the tools that remained set before them. They had lost students to the Grim before. The ones they never recovered were always the hardest. The loss of life was always a tragedy, but the uncertainty of knowing that they could still be alive and running from incessant threats in this world were what grieved them the most. As Nebo made his way back to his aides, who recovered the broken equipment, the instructor eyed Havalia's blade in particular. He recalled their last meeting and how the conversation came back to Gideon. He considered if it was the right thing to have answered her question about him. In his mind, he was uncertain. In this world, he couldn't be.